This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
Well, this old-fashioned radio is very, very exciting to me, and it's a wonderful occasion to look back and in approximately 20 episodes, just review my great research discoveries over half a century. It's been that long, and looking back, it's sort of things fall into place, and I thought really the best way to begin, because it's all about me, at least at the beginning, was to start with the two pivotal moments. And so the first two episodes are basically how I came to Calgary, and it's Calgary. Calgary makes me. It's Calgary that does it. The University of Calgary, Department of History. I got this wonderful job. I was there for 35 years and enjoyed it immensely. Great privilege. And I had support for my interest in Canadian history, good students, just incredible. Time out in the summer, and there were sabbaticals. It was really fantastic. And I must say, that's episode one without any question for me. It's University of Calgary made me. So let's start there. That'll be episode one. And then episode two will slip into the big transformation, which actually took place before I came to Calgary in 74. And I was an internationalist. My interest in history was world history until the marvelous, exciting summer of 1968. Yes, 68, the year after Expo 67, which I had the good fortune to work at as a guide at the Ontario Pavilion. After that, 67, next year, 68, that's when the transformation came. And I changed my interest from, always stayed interested in the world, but primarily my interest became my own country. So that's the background. Episode one, we're going to do Calgary, and that's 1974 when I arrived here. Introduction to things here in Calgary. And the first part, the second episode will be dealing with the transformation just a couple of years before I came from international interest to primarily Canadian. So let's go. I'd like to begin then, episode one, which really centers on one individual. And I must say, let's not go into this with any illusions. I am primarily a biographer. That's what I love in Canadian history. Please, teaching at university, you have to do all kinds of things. But research-wise and writing, always very strong interest in biography. So what are we going to do in this first episode? Well, of course, we're going to take a biographical look at one of the most extraordinary people I ever met, and that is George Self. And George Self was the founder of the history department at the University of Calgary. And I'll tell you his story in what follows. And he and I had a bridge when I first arrived here in 1974, and I'm not going to tell you immediately. I'm going to hold back on that one. But George and I, the neophyte just beginning his career, and the seasoned gladiator, the professor who's ending his career, we had a common bridge. And I'll tell you that. That's sort of the center of this episode. But first, I'll just explain that, well, that's the preliminaries. I arrived here in August of 1974, and I was fortunate because our founder, the history department was founded in 1947, and the founder was still teaching, George Self. He had 2 more years to go, and I knew him. I talked with him a number of times. And George was from Nova Scotia. His dad was a telegraph operator in Canso, Nova Scotia. And in ancient days, the telegraph, the North Atlantic Telegraph, went over via Newfoundland to Nova Scotia, to Canso. That's near Cape Breton Island. And his dad came from Britain, and he was a telegraph operator there for a number of years. And his mom was a teacher. So George grew up in Canso, in Nova Scotia. And it was there he did his primary education, and later on he went on, good student, who went on to Dalhousie. King's College. King's College, which is affiliated with Dalhousie University, King's College in Halifax. So his uncle actually was the principal of King's College, so there was a personal link. And he studied there. He was born 1910, and George studied there in late 1920s. Did again, was wondering though, didn't wondered what's next, and decided a career in education. So his dad died, and his mother had remarried and moved to Montreal. So in late 20s, George transferred from King's College to Macdonald College. That's the McGill's Faculty of Education, and there he did his teacher training. George had learned French. It's very insistent on the importance of learning French, especially since he was living in Quebec. And he applied himself to other languages too. When he did his PhD, he had to have a knowledge of German and Italian for the topic, which I'll tell you about shortly. And he mastered those, just a reading knowledge, mind you. But with French, he really worked at it and was fluent and at ease, of course, reading and writing to a certain extent. So George then is now established in Quebec in the Protestant school system, the English language Protestant school system, and he taught a number of schools in Quebec, including one, incidentally, in northern Quebec, Maniwaki, which is very close to an Algonquin reserve, First Nations reserve. But he didn't have any contact really with First Nations people. That was just an aside. The large community was near the town of Maniwaki. But he also taught in Montreal. And, this man is a perpetual learner, always like a blotter. He just wanted information and history and what have you. George, when he was in Montreal, he started an MA. And his chosen field was English history, English political history, early 19th century. He completed that, and really he loved it so much. The joy of his life at this point was he got to do a half-year research in London, England, at the British Museum and the Public Record Office to complete his thesis. It's on the Chartist, early 19th century political group in England. So that was great. Now he's going to these. He has to make a living, so he's teaching and all. And sometimes Maniwaki was fairly isolated. That was after Montreal, but he kept the dream alive of further study, and he applied and was accepted to the University of Chicago, the very distinguished school. So that's quite a compliment, quite a feather in his cap. So George went to Chicago. Now, how's he going to support himself? It's 1939. That's the beginning of the war for us. And America enters 2 years later, 1941. These are tough years. In Chicago, he's got to pay for his studies. So what did he do? He was a night clerk in a hotel. Incredible. A year and a half. And after that, to pay for his studies, he became, planning rail routes for the major railroad railway in Chicago. He planned the rail routes for them. So those were his jobs, and progresses with his MA, with his PhD. Excuse me, his MA is completed. Now this is where that's where I'm going to tell you the secret. George and I shared one common, definitely right from the outset, there was one common interest. I found him, he's an eccentric. I found him very, very appealing. But what we were sort of the real talk that we had at the beginning was about the subject of his PhD thesis. Now, this is really, really a long shot, but it's true. There's no fabrication with this one. George, in 1939, when he arrived in Chicago, he didn't have a thesis topic. But he told me, this is a personal story. He said that, he was walking down the street in Chicago shortly after arrival, and he saw newspaper headings. Italy invades Albania. Now, Albania is a small country east of Italy, north of Greece, a small country, only became independent in 1912. It was part of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and it's a very it's a small country, very complex, very interesting one. But George, he saw this article, these headlines, and Italy invades Albania. And George said to himself, Albania. I know nothing about Albania. I'm going to study that. So that's what he did. He did his PhD thesis on the foreign relations of Albania. Just an incredibly specialized topic. And he had a reading knowledge of, well, French he was quite competent in, and then reading knowledge acquired of Italian and German. So George did his thesis. Now, what's the commonality? I've been teasing you with this. Now let's come out, bring it all forward. Um, I had shared an interest in that because in high school, I'd done a report in grade 10. I did a report on Albania. No, it seems absolutely impossible that this was the case, but it's true. And to prove it, I still have my report. No kidding. It was actually on Yugoslavian Albania. And unfortunately, the two Albanian manuscripts that I completed for this class report are gone, but the Albanian one miraculously survives. Well, George and I had conversations about that, and it was he was fun. He was different. Um, but incidentally, I'll insert this at this point. He never published. That's of course that this is old school. This is a different atmosphere in a university, and I'll explain his context in a minute. But it was just so well read in so many sectors and all. Now back to though. We just got his PhD. It's 1943. George joins the Canadian Navy, and he's back in Canada and spends 3 years in the Royal Canadian Navy in Halifax, and there he is. Uh, it's called a writer, most appropriate for him because he's very articulate and well read. He became a writer. That meant he did the correspondence for the commander at Halifax headquarters, Royal Canadian Navy. The commander, he was the writer and helping there. But he does also, George Trumbull, he's also an extra man with harbor freight. Halifax in the late part of the war, and that's 43 to 45, very great labor shortage. And so George, he helped in the harbor unloading freight. He had his day job of being a writer with the Navy, but he also helped out by doing freight for 2 years. Well, war ends, thank heavens, and George, he worked with the archives in Nova Scotia, actually, for a year. But news came of a job at a university, University of Alberta, and it was a new posting. The University of Alberta had expanded. It had taken over the normal school or teacher training college in Calgary, and the normal school, as it was called, had now become the Calgary branch of the University of Alberta Faculty of Education. So they advertised for a job, and well, George married. He had a large family, and eventually it'd be 7 children. So, well, he just didn't have time for further study. He wanted to go back to London and study Slavic studies, Eastern Europe. Central Europe. He wanted to, but he couldn't. He had to, of course, naturally, family comes first. So he applied and got the job in Calgary. So, wow, quite a transfer. Halifax out to Calgary. Alberta then had 800,000 people. Calgary had 100,000. That's approximately, what would that be? 7 or 8% of what it has now, over 1 million. So he comes to this small town, but he's there for the big explosion. George comes in 47. That's the year of the Leduc discovery, oil discovery, up north near Edmonton. And what happened in Calgary was we had the headquarters for the oil companies because of a previous strike at Turner Valley, south of Calgary. So the headquarters were here. The oil field was up near Edmonton, but the headquarters are here, and they stayed here. So Calgary goes, it's not still Turner Valley a bit, but the real field is Leduc. But the headquarters of the oil companies are here. So we're getting a terrific spinoff from this. And the oil and gas boom just takes off shortly, late 1940s, early 50s, and Calgary, oil and gas capital of Canada. And George is all part of that. Now, what kind of a man was he? Well, he was open-minded. He was an internationalist, and this is once he got into Calgary, he was assigned to. Well, he started the history department, but he also taught economics. What quite a combo, George. And also he pushed international affairs a great deal in town. This was a very provincial city in the late 40s, and George did his best to correct that. One of the I, outstanding, remarkable things he did was there was a considerable anti-Japanese climate in Alberta, well, across Canada because of the war, and in 47, 48, still remained. Well, but George, he didn't, no, it wasn't, he was, well, it just had nothing, it said nothing to him. He was against all that. He was an internationalist, and a young artist, Roy Cayuca, who had come down. His family had been sent away from Calgary, shipped up to a farm in the early 1940s after the Second World War escalates to the Pacific, and the Japanese were sent away from urban areas. And it was in BC, but also in Alberta. His family had been sent up north Alberta, and Roy, though, wanted to be an artist. And in 1946, 47, he applied to the art college in Calgary, and he got in. Now, where's he going to stay? This is a tough one. Well, George rented a room to him. That's remarkable. And Roy always was grateful for that and remembered so well how good George was, and how George opened up his record library to Roy. And that's when Roy says, Roy later, his brother Harry told me, said this, that's where Roy learned about jazz and became an aficionado. George loved jazz. He loved music, all kinds, but jazz was a particular interest. So here we got an internationalist, man of the world, just incredible. Now, once George gets here, he was not, what did we say, company man. He wasn't. He thought and spoke for himself. He was very antagonistic to the way the University of Alberta treated the Calgary branch, and George wanted independence. He wanted full control, and so little friction there. Also, he had a bit of a struggle with the bureaucracy. The administration of the Faculty of Education Calgary branch, at one point in the late 40s, said that male instructors, and they're almost all male, had to wear a jacket and tie for their classes. George rebelled. He wore a T-shirt under a jacket. That's the kind of guy he was. It's just endearing. And so, anyways, there's a portrait of him with his jacket and his T-shirt, which makes it all real. So, again, though, he's an internationalist. And he's promoting international talks in Calgary and whatnot, but he's also going on site. In 1949, must have had an early sabbatical, he went to Africa and traveled around Africa. I remember him telling me about this. I think it was he was able somehow to go by plane to a lot of these places. It's a pretty early aviation tour of Africa. And I remember clearly he was so excited, energized by these huge political assemblies in Ghana, where then called the Gold Coast, which was on its way to independence. And this was similar to in Nigeria and other countries. So Africa's on the edge of ending colonialism and becoming independent. So very, very exciting. So George translated that into his teaching. His teaching was, Britain, Europe, Canada, and also is really Africa. He developed a teaching specialty in that, but it really was, as I mentioned earlier, he really was not writing. He had too many students. I mean, this is a Faculty of Education. Student load is very high. He's got 7 kids, and he's got a huge family. It just didn't work. So his contribution, but he did a major contribution in building up the library. So it's a different era, and George contributed greatly to stimulating interest in history and international affairs and economics too in the city in those early years. He was great with students. He really was. He, one of the old timers told me that he would have, George would invite students over to his place, he and his wife, and they'd listen to records. George came out with brought forward his homemade wine, and they'd have a merry time. Some students stayed till dawn, at which time his wife brought out breakfast for them. What that is at a university? It just seems so much fun. It was that he just was like that, and always when the Hungarian refugees came in 1956, he and his wife provided housing for three of them in their own home, and George and a colleague taught English special courses for Hungarian refugees in those difficult years at the beginning, 56. Well, the history department, quickly, it expands. Calgary, the university goes from, Faculty of Education, University of Alberta, it grows from several hundred, and eventually the government of Alberta allows for an expansion. There's an arts faculty in 51, followed by phys ed in Faculty of Physical Education in 1956, faculties of Commerce and Science in 1957. It becomes a much larger institution. By 1960, it's about 1,000 students, and another appointment was made to the history department. And George can stop, and he stops teaching economics at that point, and it's just history. And he's got a colleague, Friedel Hyman, who is a refugee actually from Nazi Europe. He was a specialist on Central Europe and had really a great reputation. He joins George in the department, and the others follow. Bob Shields, Canadian history, he came shortly after that too. And I knew Bob. It's growing. That's the point, and it's growing to the point in 1974. I come, and there's over 20 instructors by that point. So I was in there just the whole thing is just expanding and going so well. Now George is a teacher. He was good. He had very good enrollments. His Origins of World War I and World War II courses were particularly popular. So he was a popular instructor, but it was different in that, for example, when he was dealing with in the World War I course, which of course has to go up to 1914, George would very rarely get by the mid 19th century. Like he just doesn't so much information. He's just falling short with the timeline. But the student that told me about this, they still, it was thought provoking, and he covered the major issues, and so they liked him a lot. But there was a joke that if you took a course with George, you were self-taught. Isn't that fun? It's self-taught. And the old timers who had his courses, they'll still tell you that. Yes, they were self-taught. So, George, now we're getting near the end. He's kept at it, building this department, very strong, and building up the library. But still, he remains essentially the same person in that international interest is there. And also, Canadians, very interested in Canada. When René Lévesque came, Tarek Ishmael, a young instructor in political science, invited René Lévesque, then young opposition member in the Quebec government, Quebec legislature, to come to Calgary. René Lévesque, a couple of years later, founder of the Parti Québécois, and so he invited him, and George, of course, was in on it. So he loved, and they talked. René Lévesque and George had a great time in 1971, the time of his visit. Well, I arrived 1974, and I had the good pleasure of knowing George till 70, as a colleague till 76. Then he retired. He had some health issues and had to, in assisted living actually, on the late 70s and early 80s until he passed away in 1985. I had the good fortune to visit him a number of times, and he made the best of this. He's still reading and doing his best to keep up, but unfortunately, this health card came up. Overall, I was so blessed, stimulating individual, and a great internationalist. And of course, I had become a Canadianist, but I still remained very interested in the world. And episode 2 is about how I became a Canadianist. Let's go.